Some stories from the war were never meant to sound believable. They live in hangar gossip, in combat reports buried under dust, and in the quiet pride of pilots who saw the impossible. This is one of those stories. It began as a joke, the kind that echoed across German airfields in the dying years of World War II. The Luftwaffe called the American P-47 Thunderbolt a flying coffin. They laughed at its size, its shape, its slow climb. They said it was too heavy to fight and too clumsy to live through one. But history would remember it differently. Because the plane they mocked, this stub-nosed brute of aluminum and thunder, would one day outfly the most advanced jet the Reich ever built. Hit subscribe and like the video. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the end of this story, you'll understand why speed alone never ruled the sky and how arrogance, not altitude, can bring a pilot down. The winter of 1944 was not kind to Germany. The Luftwaffe was bleeding men and machines faster than the factories could replace them. Allied bombers filled the daylight with contrails, their engines rumbling like a storm that never ended. Every week, cities burned, fuel trains vanished, and the German High Command searched for a miracle. They found one, on paper, in the form of the Messerschmitt Me-262. It was sleek, silver, and fast enough to break everything the Allies thought they knew about air combat. 2 jet engines instead of 1 propeller. Speeds climbing beyond 500 miles per hour. 4 30mm cannons mounted in its nose that could tear a bomber apart in seconds. The Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, and to German propaganda, it looked like salvation with wings. In Luftwaffe briefings, officers spoke of the jet as the weapon that would end the bombing campaign. It could climb faster, strike harder, and vanish before Allied escorts could react. Hitler himself called it his Blitz bomber, ordering it to carry small bomb loads against troop concentrations, a decision that delayed its full deployment as a fighter. Engineers protested, pilots begged to fly it purely for interception, but politics ruled the Reich as much as physics did. Even so, the first squadrons entered service in the summer of 1944, flying out of Lechfeld and Munich. The Allied reconnaissance photos taken that autumn showed something new glinting on those runways, jets that left no propeller blur. To the Americans, it felt like science fiction had joined the war. "It's too fast to catch," pilots whispered in the mess halls of England. They were right. Almost. Across the Channel, on Allied bases like Boxted and Molesworth, the aircrews could see their own machines lined up by the dozens. The B-17S and B-24s they guarded lumbered into the air like fortresses, while the P-47 Thunderbolt squadrons idled, waiting for escort assignments. Compared to the sleek Mustangs or the agile Spitfires, the Thunderbolt looked like a bulldog that had swallowed its own engine. With its round fuselage and broad wings, it stood almost 11 feet tall on its landing gear. When it roared down the runway, the ground shook. Its radial engine, the Pratt Whitney R-2800, was the largest piston engine ever fitted to a single-seat fighter at the time. It burned more fuel than most twin-engine planes and guzzled air like a furnace. German pilots joked that the Americans must have built it from leftover tank parts. They claimed it couldn't turn, couldn't climb, and certainly couldn't catch a jet. The flying coffin, they said, was proof that the Allies were throwing metal into the sky faster than they could train pilots. In a sense, they weren't wrong. The Thunderbolt was massive. It weighed nearly 8 tons fully loaded. But what the jokes missed was what happened when that weight met gravity in a dive. Before the Me-262s ever took off, the Thunderbolts were rewriting what survivability meant. In ground attack missions, They were returning home with flak holes big enough to crawl through. The air-cooled radial engine could take hits that would kill a liquid-cooled Mustang in seconds. And when pilots pushed the stick forward, the jug, as its own crews called it, could drop through the sky faster than anything with wings. Test pilots recorded dives exceeding 550 miles per hour before compressibility shook the frame. Few planes of that era could survive that kind of punishment. Fewer pilots dared to try. Still, in the final year of the war, image mattered more than endurance. The Me-262 looked like the future, and the P-47 looked like the past. One glided, the other thundered. One whispered speed, the other announced power. The German jet represented innovation in its purest form, the culmination of years of design under pressure. The American brute was, at best, a workhorse. But wars are not won by elegance. By autumn 1944, as the first Me-262s streaked across the skies of Germany, Allied bomber crews began reporting silver flashes that appeared, fired, and vanished before anyone could react. The jets would tear through a formation, down a bomber or two, then disappear. Intercepting them seemed impossible. P-51 Mustangs tried climbing intercepts and failed. Radar operators learned to track the jets near their bases, where they slowed for landing. But it was a desperate gamble. The window between vulnerability and escape was measured in seconds. Luftwaffe pilots grew confident. "No Allied plane can touch us," one diary from a Me-262 squadron reads. "They are too slow, too blind." That confidence spread across airfields, and with it came the laughter, the snide jokes about the American flying coffins that kept showing up over rail yards and bridges. The same pilots who feared the endless waves of thunderbolts on the ground dismissed them in the air. To them, they were targets, not threats. But inside those thunderbolts were men who had learned patience from survival itself. They didn't need to be faster. They only needed one chance. The Americans studied the jets carefully. Intelligence briefings noted how long the Me-262's engines took to reach full power, about 8 seconds from idle. They learned the jets needed long, straight runways and couldn't throttle up quickly after landing. And they waited. What the Luftwaffe saw as arrogance was really a blind spot. By late 1944, the German pilots were exhausted. Many flew with only a handful of flight hours in jets. The fuel shortage meant training flights were canceled, leaving young recruits to face veterans from the 8th Air Force who had already survived dozens of missions. For every Me-262 that took off, there were 3 grounded by maintenance or lack of kerosene. Yet the myth of invincibility persisted. In American intelligence circles, the Me-262 was classified as a priority threat. In German propaganda, it was the weapon that would turn the war around. And somewhere between those extremes, the pilots themselves, men on both sides, knew the truth. Speed wasn't everything. Reliability was survival. At the airfields in southern Germany, as winter turned to spring, the laughter about flying coffins started to fade. Reports began circulating of thunderbolts ambushing jets near their runways. A few of those accounts were dismissed as exaggeration, but rumors have a way of flying faster than bullets. Every pilot who heard one thought the same thing. What if it's true? That question, the seed of doubt, was the beginning of the end for German air superiority. The story that follows would erase the smirk from every hangar that had once mocked the jug. It would prove that armor can outlast arrogance, and that sometimes the heaviest plane in the sky carries the heaviest punch. The world would remember the Me-262 for its speed, but it would remember the Thunderbolt for what it did next. Because the day was coming when a flying coffin would stare down a jet, and win. They called it ugly. They called it slow. They said it looked more like a milk truck than a fighter plane. But under the dull aluminum skin of the P-47 Thunderbolt lived something that no German pilot understood until it was too late: the sky's most durable killer. The Thunderbolt wasn't built for grace. It was built for war. When Republic Aviation began designing it in 1940, America hadn't yet joined the fight. The Army Air Corps wanted a high-altitude interceptor that could protect bombers, something with enough power to meet enemy fighters head-on. The result was less an airplane and more an airborne machine shop. Engineers wrapped a cockpit around the biggest radial engine they could find, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder monster capable of pushing 2,000 horsepower. Fully loaded, the plane weighed close to 8 tons. On the ground, it looked impossible to lift. In the air, it became a moving wall of thunder. Its nickname, Jug, was short for juggernaut, though pilots liked to joke it came from the way it handled like a milk jug in a storm. Yet, for all its bulk, it was brutally efficient. The wide belly gave it room for a turbo supercharger system that forced pressurized air into the engine even at 30,000 feet, something few Allied aircraft could do. While the Mustang was famous for its long legs and polish, the Thunderbolt's strength was survival. Each wing carried 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 8 in total, firing more than 100 rounds per second. A pilot could empty a 2-second burst into the side of a locomotive or shred a truck convoy in a single pass. The nose wasn't meant for elegance. It was meant for recoil absorption. Armor plates surrounded the cockpit, and the oil cooler sat safely behind thick steel. A self-sealing fuel tank kept it from turning into a fireball when hit. Pilots called it a flying tank for a reason. The plane could lose cylinders, oil pressure, and even half a wing and still limp home. Factory tests showed what kind of punishment it could take. During one trial, engineers deliberately shot holes through the oil lines and kept flying. Another Thunderbolt returned from France with more than 200 flak holes in its fuselage. When it landed, ground crews counted 5 unexploded 20-millimeter shells still lodged in the wings. The pilot walked away. In combat, those same qualities changed everything. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, proved that the Jug could not only fight, but dominate. Colonel Hubert Zemke, a Montana-born test pilot turned ace, understood what the Thunderbolt could do. He told his men never to fight on the enemy's terms. "You dive, you fire, you climb," he said. "Let the Germans try to follow." In a dive, the Thunderbolt behaved like a falling anvil with wings. Its weight turned gravity into a weapon. The Me-10-9s and FW-19s that tried to pursue would hit compressibility, a deadly phenomenon where airflow locked their controls at high speed, while the Jug still responded. More than one German ace died chasing a Thunderbolt that simply dove away and pulled out where they couldn't. By mid-1944, P-47s were everywhere. They escorted bombers, strafed trains, cut down tanks, and blasted bridges. Their kill counts kept climbing, not just in air-to-air victories, but in ground destruction. By war's end, Thunderbolts destroyed more than 6,000 armored vehicles and 68,000 trucks and locomotives. The Luftwaffe began to fear the low rumble of radial engines almost as much as the high whine of sirens. Inside the cockpit, pilots described it as both claustrophobic and comforting. The armored seat was like sitting inside a fortress. The bubble canopy, added in later D models, gave nearly full 360-degree vision. The turbocharger hissed like steam under the floorboards, and when the throttle opened, the engine didn't roar. It bellowed. "It felt like the sky itself moved when you pushed forward," one veteran remembered. German intelligence eventually admitted that the P-47 was the most difficult Allied fighter to shoot down. Reports filed in 1944 mentioned the need for at least 20 20mm hits to guarantee a kill. That number was staggering. Most aircraft in the war would disintegrate after 5. Pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 began avoiding direct head-on engagements with Thunderbolts. They preferred ambush tactics, attacking from above or below where armor was thinner. But even then, the Jug had surprises waiting. Republic engineers had built its airframe to handle stresses of up to 8 Gs, allowing American pilots to execute violent dives and pullouts that German fighters couldn't match without structural failure. This difference mattered more than raw speed. On paper, the Me-109 and FW-190 were faster, but only at certain altitudes and only for short bursts. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged engine maintained power throughout the climb, making it deadly at high altitude where bombers flew. Still, the jokes persisted. The Luftwaffe's jet pilots, fresh from flight tests in the sleek Me-262, scoffed at the idea that a propeller-driven plane could threaten them. They laughed at its size and weight, not realizing that those same qualities made it one of the few fighters able to dive as fast as a jet could accelerate. When reports surfaced of Thunderbolts attacking jets near airfields, many Germans refused to believe them. It sounded like wishful thinking from desperate men. But in 1944, even laughter was running out of fuel. Each month, the Reich's airfields shrank under Allied bombardment. Jet production lagged. Fuel rations were cut so low that many Me-262s never flew at all. Meanwhile, P-47s rolled off American assembly lines by the thousands. They could fly from rough dirt strips, operate in freezing cold or blistering heat, and return home riddled with bullets. Colonel Zemke once said, "She wasn't graceful, but she was unstoppable." That was the Thunderbolt's true secret. It didn't need to be elegant. It needed to endure. Every bolt, every curve of metal was designed to survive what killed lighter planes. When hit, the P-47 shook it off. When chased, it dove and vanished into its own thunder. By the end of 1944, more than 15,000 Thunderbolts had been built, spread across every Allied front, from the skies over France to the jungles of Burma. Pilots trusted it the way infantry trusted tanks. They didn't love it for beauty. They loved it because it brought them home. The Germans never understood how a plane so heavy could be that deadly. To them, it defied logic, until they saw one rip through their supply lines, or worse, watched a jet vanish in flames after underestimating the Flying Coffin. Every war has its ironies. The P-47 Thunderbolt was America's. It started as an engineer's overbuilt experiment and ended as one of the most effective fighters ever made. Its enemies laughed at its weight. Its pilots cursed its appetite for fuel. But when the shooting started, everyone respected its roar. The day would soon come when that roar met the whine of a jet engine, and the world's fastest aircraft would learn what happens when raw power meets arrogance. The jet was supposed to end the war for Germany. Sleek, fast, futuristic, everything the Luftwaffe needed to turn back the tide. In mid-1944, the first Messerschmitt Me-262s took to the air over Bavaria. They were powered by twin Jumo 004 axial flow turbojets capable of pushing the aircraft beyond 540 miles per hour, nearly 150 miles per hour, faster than any Allied propeller plane. To the pilots who saw them for the first time, It was like watching the future tear across the sky. The Me-262 was unlike anything before it. Its nose held four 30mm Mk-108 cannons, each firing shells large enough to shatter a bomber with a single burst. A hit from one of these guns didn't just damage aircraft, it obliterated them. Its swept wings reduced drag, and its tricycle landing gear allowed smoother takeoffs. On paper, it should have been unstoppable. But even in its perfection lay flaws. The Jumo engines were fragile, with turbine blades that warped and melted under stress. They burned scarce kerosene fuel and had to be replaced after just 25 flight hours, sometimes fewer. If a pilot advanced the throttle too quickly, the engines would flame out. If he throttled down too fast, they'd stall. Worse, they took 8 to 10 seconds to spool up, leaving the jet nearly defenseless when slow or low to the ground. Hitler's interference made matters worse. Obsessed with the idea of vengeance bombers, he demanded the Me-262 be fitted to carry bombs instead of focusing purely on interception. Engineers resisted, but their protests went nowhere. Production slowed, and by the time the jet finally entered combat in August 1944, it was already too late. The Allies had air superiority, and Germany was running out of trained pilots, fuel, and airfields. Still, when the jets appeared, they terrified bomber crews. They moved so fast that gunners couldn't track them. Veteran airmen described them as silver arrows that cut through the formations, spraying 30mm fire, then vanishing into the clouds. Onboard cameras from B-17 caught only blurs. In their first month of operations, the Me-262s destroyed over 100 Allied bombers. The Allies scrambled to find a way to counter them. But the solution came not from something new. It came from something the Germans had already dismissed. The Thunderbolt squadrons began to notice patterns. Reports from the 8th Air Force's Intelligence Section highlighted that the Me-262s were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing. They needed long, flat runways and plenty of time to accelerate or decelerate. A Thunderbolt couldn't chase a jet mid-flight, but it could wait where the jet was weakest. That's what happened on October 7, 1944. Near the German city of Osnabrück, First Lieutenant Joseph B. Powers of the 56th Fighter Group spotted a Me-262 returning to base. The jet had just finished attacking a formation of bombers and was slowing down to land. Powers dove. His altimeter spun past 20,000 feet. His airspeed climbed past 500 miles per hour. The airframe began to shake, a dive so steep that one wrong move could have torn the wings off. But the Thunderbolt held. Through his gun sight, Powers saw the Me-262's silver frame growing larger. The jet's pilot saw him too, tried to throttle up, but the engines couldn't respond fast enough. Powers squeezed the trigger, and 8.50 caliber machine guns spat a storm of fire. Tracers tore through the air, ripping into the Me-262's left engine and fuselage. The jet exploded before it could reach the runway. The flames rose hundreds of feet high, visible for miles. The combat report that day was short and direct. Target observed crashing short of runway. Flames rising 300 feet. It was the first confirmed case of a P-47 Thunderbolt destroying a jet in combat. The same plane the Germans had mocked as a Flying Coffin had just shot down the most advanced aircraft in the world. Word spread fast. The Luftwaffe's Me-262 squadrons were stunned. They were ordered to avoid combat near airfields and to never reduce speed unless absolutely necessary. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The myth of invincibility had cracked. Other encounters followed. In April 1945, near Neuberg Airfield, a group of Thunderbolts from the 405th Fighter Group spotted a formation of Me-262s returning from a mission. As the jets lined up to land, the Thunderbolts attacked. In less than 30 seconds, 2 jets were down. One exploded mid-air, the other crashed just beyond the runway. Pilots on both sides witnessed it. The slow propeller planes had beaten the fastest machines on Earth by simply being patient and fearless. American engineers later analyzed the gun camera footage. The findings were simple physics. The P-47's dive speed could exceed 550 miles per hour without structural failure, and its guns created a lethal cone of fire impossible for a pilot to dodge while landing. The Me-262's jet engines, on the other hand, couldn't react fast enough to climb or evade. In every recorded P-47 victory over a jet, the scenario was nearly identical. The Thunderbolt diving, the jets slowing, arrogance meeting gravity. Colonel Hubert Zemke summed it up best in his combat diary. The jug was a brick until you understood it. Then it became a hammer. And there's no armor against a hammer. By war's end, the Luftwaffe had produced more than 1,400 Me-262s, but fewer than 300 ever saw serious combat. Most were destroyed on the ground by bombing raids. The Thunderbolts, meanwhile, kept flying across France, into Germany, over every bridge and convoy that moved. They were unstoppable, and the laughter that once followed them through the clouds had gone silent. The Germans had called it a flying coffin. But by 1945, it wasn't the jug being buried. It was the Reich's last hope of air superiority. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Germany were chaos. The Reich was collapsing, fuel was running out, and what remained of the Luftwaffe was scattered between forest clearings and bomb-cratered airstrips. The Me-262, once hailed as the weapon that would reverse the war, was now being flown by boys barely out of flight school. Against them came the veterans of the U.S. 8th and 9th Air Forces, men who had fought across Europe for years, flying a machine that refused to die, the P-47 Thunderbolt. On April 9, 1945, near the Bavarian airfield at Neuburg an der Donau, one of the last true duels of the war unfolded. The 405th Fighter Group, flying Thunderbolts out of Saint-Dizier, France, received orders to attack targets of opportunity in southern Germany. Intelligence suggested Me-262s were operating from Neuburg, trying to defend Munich and the Danube crossings. For the pilots of the 509th Squadron, it was an irresistible challenge. That morning, a formation of P-47s crossed into German airspace at about 15,000 feet. The radio crackled with the clipped voices of combat veterans. The sky was clear and cold, the kind of day where the sun turned every canopy into a flash of silver. Below them, the black craters of bombed runways marked where the Luftwaffe had tried to hide its last treasures. Captain John A. Moore led the flight. His orders were simple: hit the airfield, destroy anything that moved, and get out fast. As they approached Neuburg, the pilots spotted movement. 3 Me-262s circling in for landing. Their landing gear was down. Moore gave the order instantly. Break formation. Go get them. The Thunderbolts dropped altitude in seconds, throttles wide open. The P-47's Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine thundered, the sound echoing across the valley like a storm. Each aircraft carried a full load of ammunition, 425 rounds per gun, 8 guns per plane, ready to unleash hell. The German jets saw them too late. On final approach, the Me-262 pilots had no time to retract gear or build speed. They tried to dive, but the slow-spooling Jumo engines responded like molasses. The first Thunderbolt opened fire from 600 yards, tracers lacing the air. One jet took hits along the fuselage. The cockpit burst into flame. The second Me-262 tried to bank left, but a burst from another P-47 ripped through the wing root. It rolled once, then hit the ground in a sheet of fire. Within 30 seconds, 2 jets, the pinnacle of German technology, were gone. The Thunderbolts climbed out, circling once before heading home. The radio remained silent for a long moment. Then one pilot said quietly, "So much for the Flying Coffin." The after-action report from the 8th Air Force confirmed the kills. Both Me-262s destroyed, one more damaged on the runway. German ground personnel later filed matching reports, noting enemy aircraft of radial engine type attacked during landing sequence, heavy damage inflicted. Those few minutes summarized the entire war in the air. Advanced machines beaten not by speed or elegance, but by experience, patience, and the ability to endure. Historians later analyzed the Newburgh engagement in detail. The numbers told a simple truth. The Thunderbolt's dive limit exceeded 550 miles per hour without losing control. The Me-262, when decelerating for landing, rarely topped 180 miles per hour. At that difference, no pilot reaction time could bridge the gap. The jug wasn't catching the jet. It was intercepting inevitability. Combat camera footage from the mission, preserved in the National Archives, shows one Me-262 engulfed in smoke seconds before hitting the ground. The Thunderbolt that fired the fatal burst is seen pulling up sharply, wings shaking under the strain. The film was later used in Allied intelligence briefings to prove that jets were not invincible. For the Germans on the ground, it was devastating. Mechanics and ground crews watched the wrecks burn at the edge of the field. Some swore that the jets had been cursed, that nothing in the Reich could win anymore. For the Americans, it was just another day of flying, another reminder that the war was ending. By mid-April, only a handful of Me-262s remained operational. Allied bombing runs had destroyed most of their bases, and the few that survived had no fuel. The Thunderbolt, meanwhile, was still everywhere, strafing trains in Bavaria, blasting tanks on the road to Berlin, escorting bombers that no longer met resistance. In the end, the jet had come too late, and the propeller-driven brute the Germans mocked had outlasted it all. By the final weeks of the war, the skies over Germany looked less like battlefields and more like graveyards. Airfields were littered with twisted aluminum, blackened runways, and the wrecks of aircraft that had once symbolized Nazi pride. The Me-262, once called the Storm Bird, was now a stranded relic. Most never even made it into the air. Fuel shortages kept them grounded, spare parts were gone, and the few remaining pilots were barely trained. The Luftwaffe's last hope had become a museum piece before the war even ended. Meanwhile, the P-47 Thunderbolt was everywhere. The Allies had turned air dominance into a system, and the Jug was the machine that made it possible. While P-51 Mustangs escorted bombers deep into Germany, Thunderbolts patrolled low and tore apart anything that moved. They strafed convoys, shredded rail yards, and flattened artillery batteries. German civilians called them Jabos, short for jagged bomber or fighter bombers, and learned to run at the sound of their engines. The numbers alone told the story. By 1945, Thunderbolts had destroyed more than 6,000 tanks, 9,000 locomotives, and nearly 70,000 trucks. No other aircraft inflicted that level of destruction on the German supply chain. They didn't just win dogfights, they erased entire front lines. Pilots of the 9th Air Force joked that if a vehicle moved east of the Rhine, it belonged to them. Colonel Hubert Zemke, who had led the 56th Fighter Group since 1943, summarized it best. The P-47 didn't just fight the enemy, it buried him under metal and thunder. The Me-262, for all its speed, couldn't change that. Jets required precision runways and refined kerosene fuel, luxuries Germany no longer had. Every day, Allied bombers cratered airfields, cutting off repairs and forcing mechanics to hide aircraft in barns or under trees. Dozens of Me-262s were destroyed by Thunderbolt strafing runs before they ever fired a shot. Fuel was the greatest enemy. The synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pölitz were bombed repeatedly by the 8th Air Force in late 1944. By early 1945, aviation fuel production had dropped by more than 90%. The Luftwaffe's remaining pilots were ordered to save every drop, even if it meant skipping training flights. In some units, jets were towed to the runway by trucks to save fuel, then coasted into takeoff. It was desperation disguised as innovation. The Thunderbolt pilots knew it. They hunted in packs, circling airfields waiting for the slightest movement. If a jet dared to lift off, the jugs would be there, diving out of the sun, engines screaming. The Me-262's twin jets took precious seconds to accelerate, seconds the P-47 needed to close the gap. Many Me-262s were shot down before their wheels even retracted. Allied intelligence recovered several German combat logs that described these moments with bitter disbelief. One Me-262 squadron reported losing 3 jets in a single day to enemy fighters of radial engine type, heavily armed, striking during landing operations. The supposed Flying Coffin had become the vulture waiting at the runway's edge. It wasn't just firepower, it was reliability. The Thunderbolt could fly 7 or 8 missions in a week. A single Me-262 might be lucky to fly once. The Jumo engines demanded maintenance after almost every sortie. Their lifespan was shorter than a pilot's assignment. The Thunderbolt's R-2800 engine, on the other hand, could take flak hits, lose oil pressure, and still bring the pilot home. American aircrews often returned with entire cylinders missing, yet the plane kept running. In one famous case, a Thunderbolt of the 78th Fighter Group came back from a raid on Cologne with a hole so large that ground crews could see daylight through the fuselage. The pilot landed, stepped out, and said, "She shakes a little in the turns, but she'll do." That was the Jug's legacy. She always did. By the time the war ended, over 15,600 Thunderbolts had been built. They flew in every theater, from the muddy fields of France to the tropical heat of the Pacific. When other fighters ran out of fuel, the Jug's turbo supercharger kept her climbing. When bombers fell, Thunderbolts were the ones circling overhead to guard survivors. For all the technical marvel of the jet age, it was the brute force machine from Long Island that closed the skies on the Reich. The final irony was simple. The plane Germany mocked as a joke had outlasted the plane it bet the war on. When Allied forces finally reached Neuburg and Lechfeld airfields in late April 1945, they found dozens of Me-262s abandoned on the tarmac. Some had half-melted turbines, others had bullet holes from strafing runs. Mechanics had scratched notes on their fuselages, short messages like "keine Kraftstoff," "no fuel," or "motor kaputt," "engine broken." And next to those ruined jets, Allied photographers captured the silhouettes of P-47 Thunderbolts circling overhead, still flying, still loud, and still alive. The slowest fighter in the sky had outflown the fastest. The lesson wasn't in speed, it was in endurance. And that's what the Thunderbolt represented, a machine built not for beauty or elegance, but survival. Every engineer at Republic Aviation knew what they were building when they designed the P-47. They weren't trying to create a sleek interceptor like the Spitfire or a long-range escort like the Mustang. They were building a fortress with wings. Its frame was made from thick aluminum skin over massive spars, reinforced around the cockpit with armor plate. It weighed nearly 8 tons loaded, heavier than some light bombers. Pilots joked that if you ran out of ammunition, you could ram the enemy and still win. Inside the Jug's nose was its beating heart, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of delivering over 2,000 horsepower. It was one of the most powerful piston engines ever put into a fighter, the same model that powered the Navy's Corsairs and Hellcats. The R-2800 could take punishment that would destroy inline engines like the one in the P-51 Mustang. A burst of flak might puncture its oil lines, shred a cylinder, even set part of it on fire, and the Jug would still limp home. Pilots told stories of flying back across the channel with half a tail missing or oil splattering across the canopy. The cockpit's thick bulletproof glass and armored seat saved hundreds of lives. One pilot described the experience as flying a tank that could climb. It was that toughness that made it perfect for the final phase of the air war, the destruction of everything that kept the German army moving. When D-Day opened the floodgates in June 1944, the P-47 shifted roles from escort to attacker. It strafed roads, bombed rail lines, and dove on armored columns trying to escape the Allied advance. The plane's 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns unleashed more than 100 bullets per second. Each round could punch through an engine block or tear open the side of a train car. When combined with 500-pound bombs or rockets, it became one of the most devastating ground attack aircraft ever built. German tank crews began to dread its engine note, the deep, rhythmic growl that echoed just before impact. A Luftwaffe mechanic later wrote in his diary, "The P-47 is not elegant. It is not graceful. It is simply everywhere." While the Me-262 was limited to short missions from carefully maintained airfields, Thunderbolts operated from dirt strips just behind the front lines. Mechanics repaired them in mud, using parts scavenged from wrecks. If one engine failed, another could be swapped in hours. The jet, by contrast, needed a full team of technicians, new turbines, and refined fuel that Germany could barely produce. That's what historians now call the paradox of technology. The Me-262 was revolutionary, but it was also fragile. The P-47 was primitive by comparison, but its simplicity made it unstoppable. And yet, for all its brute strength, the Thunderbolt had a beauty of its own, one born from what it could endure. Captain Robert S. Johnson, one of the leading American aces with 27 aerial victories, once limped back to England in a Thunderbolt that had been hit by more than 200 shells from an FW-190. German rounds had shattered the canopy, destroyed the controls, and set the engine ablaze. Johnson tried to bail out, but the canopy jammed, so he flew on. He later said, "She shook, burned, and screamed, but she brought me home." The Germans who laughed at the Jug didn't understand it. They saw a blunt-nosed, overweight target lumbering through the air. But inside that bulk was everything the war demanded: range, firepower, and endurance. The very qualities they mocked made it unkillable. The Thunderbolt pilots had a saying, "If you want to come back, fly a Jug." By 1945, even German prisoners of war admitted grudging respect for it. During interrogations, captured Luftwaffe pilots said they feared the Thunderbolt's strafing runs more than Allied bombers. One officer called it the bulldozer of the sky. And in that respect, he wasn't wrong. The Jug didn't just survive, it reshaped the battlefield below it. Its dominance proved a timeless truth about war machines. The best weapon isn't always the fastest or the prettiest. It's the one that keeps coming back for another fight. And as the Thunderbolts roared over a dying Reich, that truth echoed across the sky. By early April 1945, Germany's jet dream was collapsing fast. What had once been the Reich symbol of technological superiority, the Me-262, was grounded more often than it flew. Fuel convoys had been bombed, supply lines shredded, and runways cratered beyond repair. Mechanics scavenged turbine blades from wrecks and traded food for spare bearings, but it wasn't enough. Every day the Thunderbolts came, and every day the jets burned before they even took off. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Luftwaffe had built the most advanced fighter in the world, capable of over 540 miles per hour, almost 150 faster than the P-47, but it couldn't survive the simplest reality of war, logistics. Without fuel, speed meant nothing. Without airfields, power was just potential. Meanwhile, the American pilots who once feared the jet began to see it as a challenge rather than a threat. Reports circulated through the 8th and 9th Air Forces about the jet's weak spots: slow acceleration, delicate engines, and a blind period during landing. Thunderbolt squadrons started forming runway traps, circling suspected Me-262 bases at medium altitude, waiting for them to take off or come home. That's how it happened at Neuburg under Donau. The P-47s of the 405th Fighter Group were running one of these traps when they caught the jets returning low and slow. 2 Me-262s were destroyed before they could even touch down. The after-action reports from that mission paint a picture of how calculated the Thunderbolt pilots had become. They didn't chase jets in level flight. That was suicide. Instead, they stayed patient, exploiting what every pilot knew. A jet could run away, but it couldn't hide forever. When it slowed down, it became just another target. And in those final weeks of the war, the Thunderbolt became the hammer that smashed Germany's air defenses. It wasn't just in one encounter. Throughout April, P-47 squadrons ambushed jets near Lechfeld, Munich, and Regensburg, hitting them during takeoff or final approach. Dozens of Me-262s were destroyed on the ground, or seconds after liftoff. Allied intelligence briefings from the period show diagrams of typical Me-262 fields, runways surrounded by anti-aircraft guns, and hidden taxiways through the woods. Yet none of that mattered when the Jugs came screaming in from the clouds. The Me-262's engines, the Jumo 004s, were notoriously fragile. They took nearly 2 minutes to reach full power and burned out after only 25 operational hours. German pilots were instructed not to throttle up too fast or risk engine failure. That gave Thunderbolt pilots a 2-minute window of opportunity, a lifetime in air combat. One encounter over Regensburg was recorded by First Lieutenant Edward Curry of the 365 Fighter Group. He spotted an Me-262 lifting off and dove at over 500 miles per hour, guns blazing. His rounds ripped into the right engine, which exploded in flames. Curry later wrote, "He had the best aircraft in the world and no time to use it." This was the fate of most German jets in 1945, defeated not by better machines, but by smarter pilots. The P-47 wasn't faster, but it was available, reliable, and flown by men who had learned the hard way that patience kills. When the war ended a few weeks later, the numbers spoke for themselves. The Luftwaffe had built about 1,430 Me-262s, but fewer than 300 ever flew in combat, and less than 100 scored confirmed kills. The rest were destroyed by bombers, strafed by Thunderbolts, or captured intact. On the other side, the Allies had built more than 15,000 Thunderbolts, and they flew until the very last day. The lesson was brutal but clear. Innovation without endurance dies quickly. The Me-262 was an engineering marvel, but the Thunderbolt was a war machine, and war always favors what can take a beating and keep flying. The laughter had stopped long before the guns did. By April 1945, every German pilot who still had fuel knew the joke about the Flying Coffin had aged badly. The Me-262s that once raced across the sky were now hiding under camouflage nets, waiting for runways that no longer existed. Each new sortie felt like rolling dice with fate. Jets took off under fire, engines coughing, chased by the same prop-driven brutes they used to mock. At airfields like Neuburg and Lechfeld, Thunderbolts lingered high above the clouds, waiting. The Americans had learned discipline. Don't chase, don't climb, just watch. When the jets slowed to land, that's when the jugs dove. It was methodical, practiced, and merciless. What began as rumor had become doctrine. Hit them where the sky ends. One Me-262 pilot later told Allied interrogators what that felt like. He said he saw the glint of sunlight before he heard the roar. Then tracers filled the air, and the jet shuddered apart. "They hunted us like wolves," he said. "We thought they were clumsy, but they were patient." That patience was what won the air war's final hours. For every sleek jet that managed to climb away, a dozen more burned before their wheels left the ground. Ground crews scrawled words like "Kein Kraftstoff," no fuel, across their wrecks, reminders that speed means nothing when you can't move. In the pilot huts, silence replaced arrogance. The youngest flyers avoided the old jokes. They knew now that the coffin was still coming, slow, loud, and unkillable. Each new mission began with the same prayer, not to meet a P-47 on the way home. Overhead, the Thunderbolts kept their rhythm, up at dawn, down at dusk, engines never cold. They strafed convoys, shredded rail lines, and waited above every jet base like a shadow that never left. Mechanics patched holes, refueled, and sent them back out again. The jug didn't need glory. It just needed another sortie. By the third week of April, the pattern was complete. The Luftwaffe's miracle fighter had become a statistic. The Flying Coffin had become inevitability. Even the German civilians could tell which engine sound meant survival and which meant fire. And when the last Me-262 tried to rise from its ruined runway, the jug was there again, steady, brutal, and waiting. They called it the Flying Coffin, and maybe for a while it was. Big, ugly, slow, a machine born for punishment, not glory. Yet when the last battles came and the sleek new jets of the Reich streaked across the sky, it was this so-called coffin that stayed up there, still fighting, still returning home with holes in its wings and smoke on its skin. The Me-262 was the future. Fast, precise, and doomed. Its engines could outrun anything but time itself. Each sortie drained the Reich's fuel, burned through irreplaceable turbines, and brought the front line a little closer to collapse. For every hour a jet flew, a dozen Thunderbolts roamed the skies, thicker-skinned, easier to fix, and flown by men who understood that victory in war isn't about being untouchable, it's about refusing to stay down. By April 1945, the airfields of Germany were littered with wreckage. Bent Me-262s, their silver frames torn open like paper. The Thunderbolts that had once been laughed at circled overhead, steady and unbroken. Pilots who had seen too many friends fall simply nodded to each other. The war was ending. The coffin had outlasted the jet. In the years that followed, historians would study the Me-262 as a marvel of engineering, a glimpse of what was to come. But the pilots remembered the jug for something else entirely. It was the machine that stayed in the fight. It was the proof that simplicity and resilience could beat speed and arrogance. They called it the Flying Coffin. It answered with fire. And in the end, when the smoke finally cleared, it was the jet that lay buried.